Batteries are at the core of the energy transition, and countries like the United States and regions like Europe and China are busy building battery manufacturing plants. Well, Canada has a lot of the critical minerals needed, but no battery plants. But James Frith from BloombergNEF, he's the head of the storage division there, thinks that that's about to change. So I'm going to talk to him. Welcome to the interview, James.
Hey, Markham, thanks for having me on again. And yeah, really happy and excited to talk about the North American supply chain.
Always interested in chatting with you. You've got a global perspective on batteries, and we should point out that you're a battery scientist by profession. Give me your take on why you think Canada is well positioned to become sort of a battery hub for the North American EV industry.
So I think you've answered part of that question already in the start. Is that Canada has so many of the key resources needed in lithium-ion batteries. If you look at Canada as a whole, there's kind of lithium deposits there, there's graphite deposits, there's cobalt, nickel. The only thing that's really missing is manganese. But even with manganese, there is actually refining capacity within Canada to produce manganese sulfate, which is a type of kind of refined material that you then use in the lithium-ion battery industry. So that's one of the key areas. The second point I would then point to is when we're looking at supply chain development within BloombergNEF, there's really two things that we consider. One is, have you got the kind of raw material resources? The other one is, have you got end demand? And if you have either of these, then you can attract some of the supply chain. So if you have end demand, you can track cell manufacturing and then move up the supply chain. If you have the raw materials, you can attract refining capacity or mining and then refining capacity and move down the supply chain. Now, Canada has those raw materials. It has some domestic demand as well, but I think the key component for Canada is the USMCA, the free trade agreement with the United States and Mexico that would allow Canadian companies to sell kind of battery materials or cells into the US EV supply chain. So you actually have access to a huge end demand thanks to that USMCA agreement. So Canada has the two ends of the sandwich, if you like, and it's just about building or getting the ingredients in between to sandwich them together.
We should point out that Canada does have a fairly large auto manufacturing industry, and we were a little concerned that it wasn't going to transition to EVs quickly, but there's been a number of big announcements from General Motors and Ford of late that will take place now, and it looks like the move to set up battery manufacturing in Canada has already begun. We've got a couple of announcements from British Volt and Stromvolt. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so again, it's as you say, a fairly exciting time to be looking at Canada in terms of the North American supply chain, because we have had these two announcements for gigawatt-hour scale production. So that means that you now have cell manufacturing within Canada that will be able to serve some of those existing auto production plants that you've mentioned. There's also, some new companies or some smaller companies within Canada that are switching to electric vehicles. Lion Electric producing electric buses that is probably going to work quite closely with Stromvolt would be another one there. So you're really, now that you have that cell manufacturing and it's feeding or will be feeding into the electric vehicle industry, it just means that kind of Canada is now making that transition. And what we've seen in other regions, and when I say other regions, particularly kind of the US or Europe, once you start to have cell manufacturing, you see, or once you have one or two announcements, you see a quick transition to the EV industry and everyone wants to get a piece of it. So you see kind of more and more companies starting to invest in the region or the area.
Is this manufacturing technology, is battery technology really complex? Is it difficult, or has it been more of a commodified where, these various companies, it's easy for them to set up in Canada? They don't need, specialized expertise, that sort of thing.
So it certainly is a very, complicated process. The manufacturing process in itself is not particularly complicated, but in order to produce high quality cells that are, can be used in electric vehicles and operate safely, that does become complicated, and you do need to have a very particular skill set, and it's not necessarily straightforward to do that. But actually, there are enough people around the world that you can hire in to come and help you set up a new manufacturing facility. So there is that knowledge, and then increasingly, as we have companies setting up in Europe and more in the United States, there'll be more local knowledge to Canada, and so those people will be able to kind of go and work with British Volt, Strong Volt, and help them set up their facilities. And of course, British Volt will have by that point set up somewhere in the manufacturing facility in the UK, so they can take that knowledge and expertise and transfer it to Canada. They'll then need to train up the workers, to operate the facility. So there is some reskilling in process, and there will be some reskilling needed. But that's actually beneficial, because we're going to be losing some of the jobs from the existing internal combustion engine vehicle supply chain. So it's reskilling that working population to batteries and kind of moving the country forward for the kind of next generation of transportation.
Now, we've seen in Canada over the last few months, the federal government, the British Columbia government, both announcing programs and funding for the development of a battery industry. How important is government policy to setting up that battery supply chain?
I would say that it's incredibly important. And the reason that I say that is not because companies couldn't do it without government support, but there's so much competition these days to attract battery manufacturers that if a government, whether it's kind of regional or at the country level, if they're not offering some form of support to attract a cell manufacturer, the cell manufacturer will say, okay, well, I'm going to go and work with your neighbor who is going to give me some money to help me along this process and help de-risk my investment. So while it's not let's say kind of a necessity these days to make things more or less competitive, it is kind of very crucial in one, attracting a manufacturer, but also in showing your industry that you are actually behind this and that they're not going to, lose money on their investment by setting up in a region that then isn't going to support the EV transition or isn't going to support the rest of the supply chain to move there.
Now, you make it an interesting point in a Bloomberg article that you wrote about this, and that is that Canada's low emissions power grid could play a big role in attracting battery manufacturers. We've got 60% of our power comes from hydro, another 20% from low emissions, from nuclear basically, and renewables. And how important is that to battery manufacturers?
So this is a really interesting topic, and certainly, if you look at automakers in Europe and cell manufacturers in Europe, the sustainability of cells is crucial going forward. There's EU legislation that is going to require companies to label the carbon footprint of their cells by 2024, and by 2027, they'll be ranked according to how efficiently they're produced, essentially. So in Europe, that is crucial. We don't quite see that same push in North America yet, but I would expect that is something that will develop. I think the other angle on that for kind of cell manufacturers in particular, the carbon footprint of their batteries and the manufacturing process will start to be reflected in their ESG ratings. So from an investment perspective, particularly as we have an increasing number of battery manufacturers being publicly traded. LG Energy Solution, for example, is getting ready to IPO. SK Innovation spun out its battery unit as SKON and is going to IPO it as well. British Volt is looking to list probably on the London Stock Exchange. So we're seeing more and more of these cell manufacturers that are becoming publicly traded. They are doing this for essentially a clean industry. But if the manufacturing of those cells isn't clean, it's going to reflect badly on their ESG score, which will then impact on their share price.
Just to wrap up the interview, James, you indicate in your article that the demand in North America for batteries is going to be estimated at 500 gigawatt hours by 2030. There's only 400 that have been announced. And so you're expecting we'll see some more battery plant announcements in the near future.
Yeah, certainly. We'd certainly expect that. And, we already know that Tesla is planning something in Texas at its gigaplant there. We don't know what the capacity is going to be. Even if that was up to, let's say, 100 gigawatt hours, that's still not enough to actually kind of match the 500 gigawatt hours of demand that's needed, because these facilities don't operate at 100% utilization. In general, these days they're around kind of 80% utilization. So actually, to produce 500 gigawatt hours of cells each year, you need closer to kind of 600 gigawatt hours of capacity. So I think particularly, again, going back to the US MCA, where you have rules of origin as part of that, we're going to see more of the cell manufacturing process being onshored as EV demand grows in North America.
Now, James, I've been interviewing you for a couple of years, and every time I talk to you, it seems like the electric vehicle and battery forecasts and predictions are being ramped up. As the energy transition accelerates, as the automakers invest more heavily into transitioning over to EVs. So is there any chance that the kind of numbers that we're talking about today are actually conservative, and we'll probably see them increase over time?
Another great question. And I think the answer to that is yes. We are at an inflection point at the moment where EV adoption is taking off incredibly quickly. And with these inflection points, if you shift it by a couple of months or a year, actually, your forecast for 10 years down the line changes quite significantly. So just and calculating exactly where you are in that inflection point at any one time can be difficult. So there's certainly an upside that we can see coming. The other thing that I'd add on top of that is every time battery performance improves and costs come down, we see more and more areas electrifying. So we now see, for example, the marine sector electrifying. We see increasingly in Europe, at least, the rail sector adding batteries rather than electrifying stretches of track. We're also seeing developments in off-road vehicles. So in the mining industry, for example, we're seeing more and more mining trucks adding batteries to make the operations greener and cleaner. So I think there's certainly potential for an upside here.
James, a pleasure as always. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks very much, Markham.